Good afternoon, all. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you today. The American journalist Norman Cousins once described history as a vast early warning system. Military historians might point to the substantial cuts in Britain's defence spending during the interwar years as a compelling example of what Cousins was talking about. By 1932, Britain's defence budget was more than 7 times smaller than it had been in 1919. Now, senior ministers in successive governments, from Lloyd George to Churchill, argued that diminished potential for war justified radical cuts to expenditure. We can perhaps point to Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 as a lesson from the more recent past about sitting on our laurels, particularly as it failed to prevent the hollowing out of our armed forces under the previous government. We need to respond to a new era of threat as a nation. If these two examples were warnings from history, then Ukraine is our wake-up call today. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, the UK and its allies are directly threatened by aggressive states with advanced military forces. We are already under attack through espionage, cyberspace, and manipulated information. So we must rearm and rebuild a more muscular defence for a more dangerous world. That's why the Prime Minister last week made the announcement that we would increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by April 2027. And that headline spending commitment is, of course, crucial, but the amount was just the starting gun in a much bigger race to protect Britain's security. It's not just defence spending that has failed to keep pace with the evolving threat. Defence modernisation has fallen badly behind too. UK defence remains fundamentally shaped by the risks and the demand of the post-Cold War era, where there is no direct threat to our security from a major adversary, nor an imperative to be immediately ready for war, to defend our homeland, or to mobilise our defence industry. And at a time of dizzying progress in military technology, warfare and global geopolitics, standing still means one thing, and that meant rapid obsolescence. So 2.5% is just the start of a much bigger process. The more fundamental challenge is to fully bring our armed forces into the modern era and build a leading tech-enabled military capable of deterring, fighting, and winning through constant innovation at a wartime pace. These are big challenges. And that process is already underway. As well as increasing defence spending to 2.5%, we have also, in the budget last year, announced £3 billion extra in defence spending, and we've set the ambition of boosting defence spending further to 3% in the next Parliament. We've launched the framework for a new defence industrial strategy, and we've re-emphasised something that I imagine most people in this room will know, that defence is an engine for growth. It doesn't exist separate from the economy. It is a foundation of a good functioning economy. We're improving retention and recruitment because we've inherited a crisis that is unsustainable. For every 100 people that join the armed forces, currently 130 leave. That is not a deliberate decision. That is the consequence of a system that was broken and was not fixed. And we've given the armed forces the biggest pay increase for more than 20 years and secured a deal to buy back 36,000 military homes in what was the worst, most botched privatisation of the last 40 years. All our armed forces and their families should live in a decent home. They have not been. That needs to change. And as part of plans to raise morale, we've created a new independent voice to improve service life with the Armed Forces Commissioner. The second reading of that bill took place in the House of Lords last night. And we've signed the landmark Trinity House Agreement with Germany, as well as undertaking efforts to rebuild and deepen our relations with other allies, Poland and Norway being the latest announcements where we're seeking deeper defence cooperation with those nations. But the two catalysts for reshaping the future of Britain's military are very clear from this government. The Strategic Defence Review, that will report in spring this year, and defence reform. Not one or the other, but both together. Now, taken together, these programmes represent the biggest shake-up of defence for more than 50 years. The SDR will get to grips with the threats we face, the capabilities we must develop, and the resources we need to make Britain more secure. It will ensure that defence is central to the long-term protection and economic growth of this country, and it will reinforce the imperative for defence reform. But if we're going to invest more taxpayers' money in defence, we need to ensure stronger leadership, clearer accountability, faster delivery, less waste, and better value for money throughout the defence enterprise. These are non-negotiable conditions if we are to keep Britain safe. Too much is still done in old, bureaucratic, unaccountable ways at old speed. We duplicate central tasks like finance right across defence. We limit innovation by silo working, and our procurement system is not delivering either for the taxpayer, for our armed forces, or for the defence industry that are such an important part of it. We inherited a system that is slow, inefficient, wasteful, and costly. In one area, we employ 11 checkers for each decision maker. And as a Plymouth MP, I'm told that the company that runs our dockyard needs to report to the Ministry of Defence every day whether it's snowing or not. We're introducing new points of accountability at every level within UK defence, reporting to the Defence Secretary and the ministerial team as a central point of accountability for the British people. Now, the Defence Secretary's recent speech, that I'm sure you will have followed, sets out more detail about how defence reform and the new structures that we are seeking to create will work. Not just about leadership, but about budgets as well. But the focus is not just on reforming defence procurement, accountability and efficiency. It must be on improving our warfighting readiness and increase resources that strengthen our lethality on the battlefield in collaboration with our allies. That means learning the lessons from Ukraine, changing how we fight, the doctrine, the strategy behind it, informed by the experience of how Russia is fighting in Ukraine, how we support our forces at the required tempo, investing more in uncrewed systems like drones, breaking down the defence silos that have become so persistent, with more integration across air, land and sea, space and cyber in a single joined up approach to all domain warfare, which will be the hallmark of the consequences of the SDR. And it means taking advantage of the significant opportunities that defence has to drive economic growth in all our communities as part of the government's plan for change. So we will prioritise investment in UK-based supply chain and fund innovation where Britain can achieve a competitive advantage, both militarily and economically. The starting position for all this work is a UK military with huge strengths that is respected worldwide. Our commitment to NATO is unshakable as a government, just as it is to the UK's nuclear deterrent, our ultimate insurance policy in a more dangerous world. We continue to deepen cooperation with our partners on the Global Combat Air Programme and strengthen ties with the United States and Australia on AUKUS. And our support in Ukraine remains ironclad to put them in the strongest possible position in any negotiations, reflecting that the reality that Britain and Europe's security begins on the front line in Ukraine. The talk of peace is welcome, but we risk jeopardising the peace if we forget about the war today. Over the past week, you've seen the Prime Minister lead from the front, visiting President Trump in the Oval Office, welcoming President Zelensky to number 10, and hosting a meeting of European leaders not far from here at Lancaster House, showing that under his leadership, Britain will never choose between one side of the Atlantic or the other. And defence's fundamental vision will not change. To deter threats so that fighting a war is not necessary, but being able to defeat an adversary if that is required. We cannot allow ourselves to settle back into that comfortable position that we've been in since the Berlin Wall fell 35 years ago. Never again can we be complacent about our security, nor take for granted the incredible job that the men and women of our armed forces do, nor the civilians in industry that support them. The warning from history a century ago is all too vivid for us to make that mistake again. The peace and prosperity that Europe has enjoyed since 1945 is the longest such period for many centuries. But it's important to recognise we have no natural right to that safety and prosperity. And we once again have to earn it by transforming the whole of defence and how it supports the armed forces, by investing in new capabilities and strength, by bolstering our collective security through partnerships and alliances, and by innovating and reforming at a wartime pace. That is how we will stay safe at home and strong abroad. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you for sharing those thoughts with us today. We're now going to open up to a panel discussion, and I'm delighted to be joined by Bronwyn Maddox, Director and CEO of Chatham House, and Andrea Thompson, Group Managing Director, Digital Intelligence at BAE Systems. I will shortly put some questions to our panellists, but then we will open up to the audience for questions, so do please be thinking of questions while we're speaking. When we get to that point, raise your hand and a microphone will come to you. Put questions in the chat box if you're online. We would love it if you feel comfortable, if you would tell us your name and organisation when you ask a question. And we would love it if you would ask a question rather than make a comment. The Minister does have a hard stop at 1 p.m, so we'll have to have an appropriately military approach to timekeeping today. Thank you, everyone, for that. Just a reminder that this session is on the record and is, in fact, being recorded. In fact, do post about it on your social media channel of choice using the hashtag #CHEvents. Andrea, I'm going to start with you. A lot of the discussion about raising defence spending rightly focuses on the need for a better relationship with the defence industry, particularly improvements to procurement processes, but also thinking about the skills that the UK needs, the defence industrial base that not only the UK but wider Europe needs. Mm-hmm. You're a representative of that industry. So tell us, what do you think needs to change in terms of the way government interacts with you, but also what does industry need to do better given the moment that we're in?
Okay, thank you. And just to say, I think it was a great scene-setting speech you gave there and fully support, the key comments. I think, we absolutely had to start with increase in spend and recognition that there was reform. Those two things had to happen, and we fully stand by those, and we'll stand shoulder to shoulder with the government as we go through that process. I think also recognizing that defence as a sector is a key part of the economy is key, and I think perhaps dialing up what that means for the whole UK, because this is a whole UK approach that we're really pulling together on. So dialing up that piece that says whole UK is not just about planes and ships, but it is about those skills we're learning and technologies we're learning out of things like Ukraine. It is about cyber, it is about space, it is about data and intelligence. All those things come together in what needs to happen to protect the UK and our intent behind standing behind our allies. With that, then, I would say one of the key things is we've got to get the priorities right. What comes out of that review and the reform, the priorities for the technology and capabilities in the short term, but also that long term, and having a very clear demand signal that comes through that industry then absolutely can look at what is that sovereign capability we need to stand behind and invest in and develop skills around. But then what is that capability we need to partner with others on, absolutely, that can bring not only the best of partnerships, things like GCAP, AUKUS, NBDA that we do today, but also from our allies as well. So I think recognizing the demand signal and the technologies and capabilities that can be brought very quickly into what we need both in the short and the long term. So perhaps start there as an opener.
There's a lot to come back to in there, but I want to get to people's questions. So, Bronwyn, I'll come to you. The Minister laid out some plans and priorities there, quite focused on the reforms needed in UK defence, the amount that we need to spend to kind of fill the gaps that this government sort of says they have inherited. But given the wider context, the potential retraction of the US from its role in European security, how compatible are those plans with reality? Does the government need to be thinking more radically about the position the UK is in?
Thanks very much. And thank you again for the remarks you made. There's a lot of reality out there. times of hard realism. One of those obviously is money, and you described gaps that you inherited, but also there are new challenges in the kind of wars that we think we'll be fighting, and we're obviously in the recent months been talking very much about this kind of great powers conflict, but it doesn't mean that the others have gone away. Threats from terrorism and the new technologies to respond to all these. And then there are the changes in our allies' posture and the US rethinking its approach to those, and the Europeans perhaps rethinking theirs. But all of that comes with a change, and most of that comes, apart from the European contribution, comes with a tugging at the purse strings of the UK. So to deal with the reality of money, I think the UK is going to have to look very, very hard at some of the other places it's spending money. I'm one of those that thinks it has to look hard at the welfare and benefits bills, which indeed the government, I believe, is doing. But it is much easier to put money into things that many voters very much like and have argued for years, like welfare and health and benefits, and to take it out of defence in a way, which is what's happened. It's much easier to do that than to reverse it and to make the political case for reversing it. And obviously we want to see that happen, if that's what's going to happen, without the real crisis of a war at our borders, our own borders. So I think the government has a very difficult task there to persuade the country to invest more in defence, to regard it as the public service that comes before all other public services, if you like, in terms of its urgency. So there's that whole political task. But meanwhile, as you were just both describing, trying to keep up with what the challenge actually is and what Britain is going to need to do, either on its own or in close integration with our allies, is a lot of reality to cope with.
Bronwyn, thank you. Minister, I'm going to put a question to you, and I'll pick up on a theme that Bronwyn mentioned. You mentioned the defence spending increase. The government cut the aid budget to fund that increase to 2.5% of GDP and has signalled very clearly that we need to be on a journey to 3% of GDP. And in fact, your Labour Party colleague, the former Development Minister, Annalisa Dodds, resigned in principle over the extent of those cuts. And in her resignation letter, she said that 3% may only be the start, and raising the resources needed cannot come from tactical cuts to public spending alone. And we must look again, we will be forced to look again at the fiscal rules and the government's position on tax. Is she right?
Well, I'm a big fan of Annalisa. I'm sorry to see her go. In her letter, she also supports the increase of defence spending, which I think is important to recognise. What is certainly true is by making the case for increased defence spending and by the events that we've seen in the past few weeks, a national debate has started, not just because a minister has said, let's have a national conversation, which is always the most awkward and painful moment when you see a minister say that. It is reflecting an organic conversation that's taking place in our communities anyway. And we've been clear that if we are to fund increased defence spending, we need to tell people where it's coming from, and we have done so here. But we also need to be clear about what that increased defence spending is going to do. Because I think there is a part that needs to buy public support, not assume that world events mean that we acquire it by default. And that is absolutely making the case that if we spend more on defence, we'll look after our people in uniform better, a point of shame for this country for the last decade as to how we haven't been, which is something that the public find very popular. But also by spending money more wisely, we get better kit and we create more jobs in the community. So that is about spending more money with UK firms, not sending contracts abroad, but it's also about spending more money directly with SMEs, because what we're seeing from the work that the UK government provides for our friends in Ukraine, and much of that is obviously difficult to talk about publicly, is we're seeing incredible innovation, not just from big primes, but especially from SMEs, who are creating the new technologies, who are dealing with the immediacy of a battlefield that is having more intense and evolving EW jamming every single day, where our drone capability needs to reiterate every 2 to 3 weeks. But we have a Watchkeeper drone system that was 14 years old. You know, that's what we inherited. those two things don't work together. But if we can direct that spending at SMEs in our communities and make the case that in every single constituency, there's not a MP in the House of Commons that doesn't have a defence company in their constituency. But there's so many more companies that don't think of themselves as a defence company that actually would be, especially around tech and data, as Andrea said. There's so many firms that could be contributing to our national defence if we as defence make it easier for them to participate either in joint bids for programmes or through, which I think will come out in the Defence Industrial Strategy, how we iterate the programmes. So instead of just buying a piece of kit and hoping it will last 30 years, is being upfront from the start that we'll need to iterate and invest and adapt that piece of equipment over its lifetime to make sure that it's relevant and will have the effect we're looking for as warfare changes. So we have to bring the public along with us as part of that conversation. I don't doubt there are difficult decisions. Certainly cutting international aid is not something that I think any Labour politician wants to do, especially with the pedigree that we have, but we maintain our commitment to get it back to 0.7% when economic conditions allow. But what we have to do is be tighter on the spending on that aid today. You know, we inherited a situation where 30% of the aid budget was being spent on asylum seeker accommodation in the UK. Well, I don't think that's international aid in the way that the aid agencies would want it spent on. So by cutting the backlog in small boats and asylum processing directly supports international aid. So it is a bigger challenge than just what fits under the big spending headings that we have to get to. But that national conversation is taking place right now. And I think the public recognise that we live in darker times. And they want to see government propose a route through. That's what the Prime Minister has done. But I don't doubt how hard this will be. But I think there's things that everyone in this room that cares about defence and security can do to get better value, to make it easier to respond to the threats that we are facing.
Minister, thank you. I'm going to open up to questions now because I'm conscious of time. So I'll take a few questions in a group. Let's go to the woman in pink in the glasses in the middle there.
Thank you for that. Vic Martin, so Defence Science and Technology Labs. We are the scientific branch of the MOD. We've talked a lot about the need to integrate public sector spending with industry. A lot of how we do our scientific innovation at the moment is quite transactional with industry. So we give you money, you give us something in return. What do we need to change from both sides to move from a transactional kind of relationship to a co-creation relationship where we have proper integration? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So a question on moving from transaction to co-creation. We'll take a few more. The gentleman on the edge of the aisle there in the glasses. Yep, you.
Hello, my name is Fedor Serduk. I represent MOVA Defense, exactly the Ukrainian company you've mentioned, one of those small and medium-sized who are quite inside of this game of technology. My question is, as intelligence reports suggest that North Korea is present now in Kursk region and Russian officers are coming to North Korea with even no attempt to hide this experience exchange matter of this operation. And the Western operation, Western lessons learned in Ukraine are, in my opinion, very limited. Do you have any plan or a focus on maximize the lessons learned and presence capacity, or do you have any particular things, particular lessons to be taken to your program from Ukrainian experience already? Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll take one more. Let's go to the lady just there, behind you, just there. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. Елена Коростелева, University of Warwick. My question is, we know that UK nuclear deterrent is very much reliant on the US, both technically and politically. But given how volatile the US administration is today, are there any plans to make us a bit more strategically autonomous? Let's put it this way.
Thanks. An apt phrase. Andrea, I don't know if you'd like to take the question about moving from transaction to co-creation with industry. The lady's first question.
Yeah, we have to take that one, not the other two.
Save the other two.
yes, absolutely recognise the transactional to perhaps a bit more co-creative or strategic even is maybe the word I would also use. And I think that's where the increase in defence budget, but also reform is really important, along with that short and long-term demand signal. I think we all recognise that the transactional process of acquiring defence capability today is very transactional, and it is very much in the here and now. And it does not reward true value, and it does not necessarily drive true partnerships. I think by doing the things we've talked about here already in the past few minutes, we can then be very clear on priorities. We can be very, very clear on then the partnership route and the sovereign route that we want to go down. And then that reform bit of also opening up how we buy and how we recognise value. SMEs, we've talked about that, for example, academia, their value into that overall equation and what it's doing for the economy. I think all those things together help move us toward what you're describing.
Thank you. Minister, I don't know if you'd like to take the question about the UK nuclear deterrent and how we need to think about being more strategically autonomous.
I like difficult questions. I think they're much more fun for the audience to listen to. Yes, on the nuclear deterrent, it is essential that the UK keeps our independent nuclear deterrent. The decision to use nuclear weapons is only able to be issued by the Prime Minister, even though we commit our nuclear deterrent to NATO. It is certainly true that I think we need to invest more in our nuclear deterrent, not just in the submarines and the people that serve on them, but in the entire infrastructure that's gone along with it. Now, we're aware that we have to renew elements of it. Certainly, I represent Devonport, and I know that decades of underinvestment means that the submarines we are now building are, I think in technical terms, too fat to fit in the docks that the submarines are refitted in. Now, we've designed new submarines, but we've not designed new infrastructure. And now we're coming late to it. Well, we've got to use defence as much more of a part of a joined-up system, investing in the technologies we need, but we also should be unashamedly, and this is probably stepping out of just nuclear to our relationship with the US in general, we must be really clear that we have a close, integrated defence relationship with the United States. It is not just in our interest that happens, it's in America's interest that they collaborate and cooperate with the UK. They gain a benefit from our capabilities just as we do from theirs as well. But I certainly think that there is a huge opportunity for investment in this. And we saw this only a few weeks ago where the Secretary of State announced a £9 billion package for new reactor technology with Rolls-Royce in Derby. Well, that will create hundreds of jobs directly, many more during the supply chain, and will really spark up an ecosystem that will support small modular nuclear reactors and the wider development as well. So I don't think it is a choice of either or. I also don't think that the relationship that we have with America has been adequately explained and the case made for it. So that's why the Prime Minister is making the case clearly. We have a strong, deep security partnership with our European friends, as we do with our American friends and Canada. And we need to make sure that we're investing on both sides of the Atlantic. Otherwise, we become less safe. And I think if I can just pick up on Frederick's question about lessons from Ukraine. One of the frustrations I have as a new minister is many of the lessons that we learned from Ukraine fit in a secret squirrel end of the department's activities. The SDR must be and is absolutely clear about what those lessons are and how we apply them to the whole UK armed forces. Now, that is about crewed, uncrewed systems. That is about speed of procurement. That is about how you operate in an EW jammed environment. That is about how a country without a navy can destroy half of the formidable Black Sea fleet using new technologies. It is about how we layer our effects to achieve the kinetic effect that is not just about a missile or a artillery shell landing where it's supposed to. All those will be clearly played through into the SDR. And I think at that point, it'll be easier, I think, for the industry to be clear on the demand signal that comes from that innovation, from that challenge, but also, and this is a challenge for parliamentarians like myself, about us moving away from a romanticism of old kit to accept a retirement of old kit that might have served us well for decades, but is not suitable to defend us in the future. And that is the progressive change that I see coming out in the SDR. So lessons learned, absolutely. Integration of our stuff, but also being clear that when we make stuff in the UK from now on, we must not be over Gucci with it. So it can only be used by UK forces. And then, because we've made it so specialist, we can't get as much of it as we wanted to in the first place. Let's start producing stuff that is designed to be NATO standard, that's designed for export, that's designed to be attritable in many cases, perhaps our high-end gear, perhaps less so. But that is a different way that defence procurement, I think, can support our industry, because ultimately, if I'm buying one bit of kit off BAE Systems and they can only sell it to me, it's going to be more expensive. If we can buy a bit of kit off BAE Systems and they can sell it to our allies all around the world, as we are doing with the Type 26 frigate, for instance, then it becomes better value, it joins our nations together, and it supports the wider economic benefit that doesn't come from bashing metal together, but from the training, the upgrades, the combat systems, everything else that supports the wider economy as well.
Thank you.
I was just going to pick up, I think that's an incredibly important point of, there's 2 points there. One is absolutely the export, and that's part of recognising the value that can flow back into the UK from that, and recognising that. But I think your other point about the lessons learned coming through in Ukraine forces an iterative capability on a daily, hourly basis. The reform we need has to take that into account versus the other part of defence and security, which is longer term in terms of it takes weeks, months, years perhaps to deliver some of that capability. And the reform bit is, the challenge is, how does it take on both? And that's back to the transactional and the strategic bit. And I think that's the recognition we as an industry and government need, and I think we've got it, and that's the part we're embarking on.
I think you're absolutely right that there is an investment opportunity here, but it is one that is incredibly difficult to get right, it seems to me. The record of procurement, this country and many others, has been very mixed, sometimes for justifiable reasons, that it is very hard to anticipate the next war and the next kind of war, and yet the cycles are very long. But sometimes for less good reasons. And we have had, as Olivia was describing on our podcast recorded earlier today, quite a sort of broad and shallow approach to the procurement that we thought we wanted as the UK, which has led to some of the bespoke design that you've talked about. So we're not buying lots of the same kind of thing, but getting one handcrafted, if you like. And I agree we need to get away from that. I think there's something we could learn from the US, which has the advantage of its size and no doubt lots of waste there to be got at, but has been very agile at working with very small companies, startups even, sometimes coming out of the universities, at getting the innovation going that then can, and particularly on this, talking about the Ukraine point, this linking up of minute-by-minute intelligence with firing and targeting and so on, getting that kind of thing going. We're also going to have a very direct conversation with our allies, European and the US, about how and what extent we're going to work together. Almost every country in Europe that is saying something about increasing its commitment to defence is saying the same thing about what is called defence Keynesianism. Oh, and we can get a boost to the economy from investing in all this. But if they and we all do it separately, it will be very inefficient and it may not all work together. So there is that conversation to be had. And I think the point you've made as well about having a conversation with the US about the efficiency of working together is still a really important one. There's been obvious and understandable reaction in the last few weeks of many countries to say, oh, goodness, we better work out how to work independently of the US. But much of our kit, and our nuclear deterrent indeed, is designed to work with them, and much of the intelligence, as we're seeing now in Ukraine. And I think that, that needs to be an explicit understanding with them. But there are going to be some tough conversations in there, including possibly the US saying, great, lots of investment needed, let's have it over here, not in the UK. So, but anyway, the conversation is inescapable, I think.
Okay, we're going to take some very quick questions. Gentleman on the aisle.
Thanks, Joshua Andresen from the University of Surrey. I just want to pick up on that last point. There's been, right focus on what Europe and the UK in particular need to do in the current situation. But I also think there has to be, with as much specificity and detail as possible, an emphasis on what the US gets from Europe and gets from NATO, and why they need the US why they need NATO and the UK. Yeah,
Okay, the lady there with the ponytail.
Thank you. Larissa Brown from the Times. Minister, I'm just wondering if you think that America is a reliable ally after it pulled intelligence sharing with Kyiv, and also if you think the regular armed forces or the reserves need to increase as part of the defence review. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to give the Minister a chance to say a few words on that, and then we'll have to probably let him go.
Fantastic, thank you. I think the case that we need to make is about the transformation of armed forces, but the benefit that working together delivers. And sometimes we believe that is an implicit assumption. And I think what we need to do is be absolutely clear that there is a benefit to the UK security and our allies by working together, by cooperating together, by supporting one another. That's the underpinning of why NATO is the most successful military alliance ever. But it is also why we need to apply those and not be scared of saying that, and being scared of saying that our future is both as a European power, but also a North Atlantic power with our American friends and our European friends together. And we should be clear and proud of saying that, because it builds on the reality of where we are. I think, Larissa, great question.
2 questions.
George Robertson has a big job in producing his SDR, which will come out soon, that will set out the shape of our structures. But what we are certainly looking at in the meantime is we've inherited a system across our armed forces where the structures are inefficient and in many cases needing reform anyway. And so he will set out the size and shape, but there's things as ministers we're already looking at about how we can deal with the retention and recruitment, for instance, that will make that work better. And in relation to reliable ally, yes, the US remains a reliable ally to the United Kingdom. We need to continue those conversations. It is the reason why the Defence Secretary is not sat here on this panel, but he is in Washington this week speaking to his US counterpart to make the case not just for our approach bringing allies together on Ukraine, but making the case for why it is in all our benefits, including the US's, that we continue to invest in NATO, why we can continue to invest in our security, and why America's priorities, looking at what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, don't happen in isolation. Indeed, you have North Korean troops fighting on Europe. That is a perfect example of how the two theatres are interconnected, and the idea that they can be separate and not have a connection from one to the other is an argument that I don't think stands a huge amount of scrutiny, but it is one that as a nation we are making the case that we are better when we work and fight together. That is the case right across the NATO alliance, and that is the case that we will continue to support our friends in Ukraine for as long as it takes.
I think with that we'll have to wrap up because the Minister needs to leave. But thank you everyone, and Minister, thank you for your time. Andrea Bronwyn, thank you so much.